All right. So interestingly, yesterday in philosophy, we came to a point in the conversation where we were talking about, let's clear that and try it again, empiricism. And the question was, what specifically does that mean? And that took me back to the concept of poetically dwelling. So I found myself saying, yeah, if it's not in Heideggerian terms bound by the limits of earth and sky, it does not exist. It's not relevant. And that immediately raised the question of, okay, if it's not relevant, then how does somebody who's essentially unable to see claim to be an empiricist? So the comment I made to my students was that increasingly over the last 10 years, I'm aware of the fact that my connection to the world has shifted away from my eyes and to my emotions. So part of what I want to look at today in terms of everything we've talked about so far, assuming it makes sense to you, is what does it really mean to dwell poetically? And does dwelling poetically somehow eliminate or dismiss our connectivity to the physical world? Because when we think about empiricism, what do we think about? Somebody who's driven radically by their perception of the world through their senses. So if we go back to human company, as we've mentioned before, all knowledge of the world is dependent upon observation. And if we recall the conversation we had about Kant, we never know the essence of anything. Remember, Kant called that the Ding an sich. We never know the thing in itself. But the promise of empiricism in some shape or form is that there is a link between what we perceive and what is actually true. If you think about the implications of that, it's one of the reasons we found ourselves up against Immanuel Kant. Because his way of getting around the possibility that the universe is totally subjective was to postulate the link between the transcendental categories and the physical world. Make sense? Okay. So when we think about the implications of that, while time and space are still the fundamental categories that shape all of human cognition, it doesn't free us from the question of what's true. Am I making any sense? I'm not sure I am. Okay, let's come at it from a different perspective. When we think about what Kant is attempting to do, let's go back to David Hume for a second. Hume, when he approached the world, said, on the one hand, all knowledge is based upon perception. If we follow that to its logical conclusion, then all knowledge of the world is ultimately subjective. We ultimately don't know the world. Does that make sense? Yeah. Part of what we've seen is that what damaged Edward Herbert was the assumption that in some shape or form the intelligibility of the world produced some kind of objectivity. And what we've seen is that the rise of utilitarianism says that that just didn't work. So Hume tried a different approach. If we look at the world, we see the complexity of the world. We have two choices. We can assume that the complexity of the world was totally random, or that it was intentional. By the way, does this line of argument sound familiar? Someone else we've studied used this same way of looking at the world. He said, let's begin with the assumption that the world is either absurd or it makes sense. If the world is absurd, if nothing makes sense, if there is no certainty, the world is absurd. I'm going to rule that out. Rene Descartes. So it's the same gambit, the same logic that Descartes used. You can't look at the physical world and not see that it is obviously ordered and structured. So we have two choices. Either the watch made itself or someone made the watch. So the implication that we get from Hume is twofold. Ultimately, that there must be a God, and that the intelligibility of the world cannot be denied because it is the creation of God. Okay, thoughts so far? Am I making more sense? Okay, so when we look at this, then we basically have painted ourselves into two options. The idea that this is simply absurd precludes any conclusion other than the world is ordered and structured. So two things happen at this point. Initially, with deism and natural theology, the assumption ultimately is that the source of all logic and reason is God. So to know the world is to know God. By the 19th century, the knowing and the relationship to God become disconnected. To know is to know the laws of the universe. So if you think back for a minute to our conversation about the Protestant Reformation, in philosophy, when we were talking about that yesterday, essentially the threat that Bruno and company posed was that if the earth was not in the center of the world, center of the universe, then God was not in the center of the universe, and any sense of truth collapsed. Right? So the argument became that the Bible could substitute. Instead of God directly being in the center of the universe, the center of all truth becomes the Bible. When that occurs, science detaches from religion. And remember, this is in part the whole dilemma that gets Bruno killed. Because for Bruno, it's not necessarily just the question of the sun being in the center of the universe. It's that science stands in judgment of theology. Remember that? So down comes the world. But the genius of the Protestant Reformation is to replace God with the Bible. Doesn't matter where God is now. But the result of that is that ultimately modern science replaces theology, but its assumptions about the nature of the world are the same. That the universe is driven by laws, that it is intelligible, it makes sense, it is ordered. So if we think about Heidegger's critique of technology, it's essentially that it distances us from the world. If you remember our conversation about Wittgenstein, language is the scaffold we place around the world. When we focus on the scaffold, we're focusing on a scientific, logical analysis that serves to further distance us from the world. The scaffold, not the experience. So if we sort of look at a kind of Wittgensteinian diagram, so Wittgenstein says there are two types of language. Language which shows, and language which says. And what I'm implying is that the language which says is essentially the scaffold. When we dwell poetically, there is no scaffold. Okay, let me see if there are any questions so far and if this is making sense. Sure. There is no scaffold. Mm-hmm.
My question is, what's the difference between language saying?
Okay. According to Wittgenstein, language which says is inherently the language of myth and poetry. There is no logic. It is the world as the world presents itself. Whereas, conversely, language which says is totally dependent upon logic and reason. And that's why it fundamentally detaches itself from the physical world. So if you think about it, language which shows doesn't think about truth. It doesn't think about verifiability. Does that make sense? Okay. So if you think about it within that context, then the very enterprise of science no longer applies. Okay? All right. So when we talk about poetically dwelling, by definition, we're talking about stepping away from the very characteristics that cause Hume to assume there has to be a God there. The focus becomes not on knowing, but on experiencing. So ultimately, you could say that Zen Buddhism is right. There is nothing to know. That to truly be in the world is to never ask the question of truth and false. The question fundamentally shifts away from that. Let me try to adjust my screen again. Let's see. One of these should let me get there. Let's look at that. And okay, now I can see better. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but can you also say that God is like, you know, we talked about like the founder and first gen and second gen. Well, the third generation doesn't know that the founders existed in them. So could you say God's in the middle and you just the third generation trying to survive without the knowledge of the first gen?
Exactly. And if you put it in another context, then one of the rules of mathematics in the 20th century was this: And what that ultimately means is this. Every logical system begins with a series of assumptions. That cannot be proven true. You simply accept them or you reject them. So if we put Hume's dilemma, if we put Descartes' dilemma in this context, then the ultimate assumption or the ultimate hypothesis is that God exists. Because ultimately Nietzsche was right. If there is no God, there is no truth. Am I making sense? This is an important and not necessarily obvious point. You okay, Ashley?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So when you think about this, then Nietzsche becomes dead on. We need the God of good and evil, or the world falls apart. And if it's not the God of good and evil, then it is the God of science. And the point is that underneath all of this, there is some kind of need for an ultimate truth, a starting point that cannot be otherwise questioned. So if we go back to Descartes' question, and we look at those two objects, or those two options rather, the implication is that when you dwell poetically, there is no need for certainty. This becomes the two questions that we find in Heidegger. What does it mean to be an I, and why is there something rather than nothing? So if we take it to the next step, we can focus on looking for the truth, or we can dwell, but we can't do both. To dwell poetically mitigates the need for any sense of truth. And truth mitigates poetic dwelling. Okay, let me stop there for a second. Is this making sense? So when we talk about things like the linear nature of logical time, that's based on a concept of truth, which is not necessarily applicable to the world in which we live. When we go back to the conversation about time wrapping around itself, there is no linear process. There is only being there in the world. I am time. I am the center of the world. Okay, questions, thoughts? Making sense? Okay, so when Heidegger writes an essay called The Way Back into the Ground, of metaphysics, his point is that the meta of the physics meta, beyond or above, in Greek, is in and of itself a fundamental departure from our experience and encounter with the world. We said last week that the Aristotelian enterprise has effectively two domains: the metaphysical and the physics. Heidegger's argument is that to really get back, we must fundamentally reject both of these. That rejection is a letting go in order to be in.
I'm not sure if it's important, but your phone is ringing.
I'm sorry?
Your phone is ringing. I don't know if it's important.
Okay, let me check it. Thank you. Yeah, you can hold it, sure. Okay. All right, thoughts so far?
You said who's the intellectual justice?
Heidegger. Yep. If you're going to ask the question, what does it mean to be an I? Why is there something rather than nothing? Those are not questions that are going to be answered effectively by metaphysics. The irony is that both physics and metaphysics, in attempting to build logic, take us away from our connection to the world. Make sense? Okay, so ultimately, if we reject this, then this is where the concept of dwelling and measuring, which we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, becomes so very important. So the $30 philosophical word is epistemology. From the word meaning to know. Know in the sense of understanding. And the essence of dwelling poetically is a rejection of knowledge. And the acceptance and affirmation of experience. What I find particularly interesting as I'm working through this with you there's no need for truth or objectivity. It doesn't matter to me whether my perception of the color red matches your perception of the color red. The experience of the appleness of the apple is all that really matters. Okay, questions so far, thoughts so far? This is particularly deep, so I want to make sure we're good. Okay. Do you see a problem with this?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's like trying to say everybody sees the same.
Mm-hmm.
So like different experiences start to lose common with people and doesn't lose common like certain people would be completely drawn to it.
Yes, and the danger and existentialism has been tagged with this over the course of its history is that it falls prey to solipsism and to nihilism.
Because yeah, that's nothing really matters.
In part, yes, but this becomes the question. If we go back to our conversation about Camus, His attempt to get around that is the concept of solidarity. But is that enough? And this becomes the heart of the problem. Okay, are we all right at the moment? Ready to move on? Okay. So now we come back to love. To take the death of the other as one's own. But in love, there is still the realization that the best that we can be is alone together. There is also the realization that while I can take your death, as my own, it still is not mine. So, what does this mean? Does this mean that I am in some way vicariously experiencing your death? Or is there something more? Is it enough to be alone together? Or is this sense of aloneness truly the end of love? Though he meant it differently to some extent, Miguel Unamuno, when he talks about the overwhelming tragedy of human existence, is describing in part the essence of love. No matter how deeply, completely, and totally I love you, you remain apart. I can take your death, but you're still the one who will die. So, the point that I want to make, and we're going to have to see how this works out, is that when you dwell poetically, you cannot escape the encounter with the tragic. And I'm going to argue that in the very nature of time wrapping itself over the course of a lifetime, that deep sense of tragedy becomes even more profound and more powerful. Okay, before I obliterate this, questions, comments, thoughts?
So essentially, you're trying to say that with traveling between these two, like the inner life and the vicarious, see that you actually correctly that well because you have a strong sense that
That's right. Yes. I was having a conversation with my dark sister yesterday. If you want to talk about days that go from one end of emotional sadness to another, standing in front of a class and admitting that I'm well on the way to not seeing any more with my eyes, not even knowing how I navigate the world most of the time. My dark sister, whose dog is ill, said that she's reached a point in her life where the only realization is that everyone and everything she loves will ultimately die. And that profound encounter with loss is beginning to dominate her life. So if you go back to philosophy last semester, we talked about Camus' portrayal of Caligula. And we said that the reason Caligula murders everyone he loves it's because time even steals his grief. This is profoundly true in linear time. And to some extent, even encyclical, or the wrapping of time. Example, in my study, I have a pipe. I can't remember at this point whether it belonged to a friend of mine who was killed by a drunk driver when we were 24, or if it belonged to my father. But the question of who it belonged to is irrelevant because I can still feel the sadness, the loss of both of those men in that pipe. So when we live in a world in which time wraps around itself, when we dwell poetically, is effectively to wrap emotion on top of itself. So sadness from the past is sadness in the present. And it shapes my experience of sadness in the future. And there's a sense in which, over the course of my dwelling, my emotions intensify. When I grieve in this moment, I don't grieve in this moment. I grieve with all the moments I've ever grieved.
You know, like the death of somebody you love does really hit into like moments onto.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. To some extent, yes, we carry forward memories. But more important than the memories are the emotions that we carry forward. And those emotions shape our dwelling. This takes us to a point where we're caught in a kind of perpetual tension. For example, the beauty of sadness. and the sadness of beauty. When I look at a flower in all of its glory, at the pinnacle of its beauty, I can feel the sadness of the flower. I can feel my sadness. I can feel the dying of the flower. So the more deeply we dwell, the more the tension between seemingly contradictory emotions intensifies over the course of our life. So if we put this in terms of the opposite of love is death, the more that I experience death, the more deeply I love. So, questions, thoughts?
So it's safe to say that the dwelling of the memories inside of us is what shapes us.
Uh-huh. If you go back to philosophy, one of the things that we said was that what is fundamentally unique about humans, other than our awareness of death, is that humans can attach an emotional experience to an object and return to that experience. As though the past had been brought into the present.
I didn't really understand that until last night. When I was playing basketball, a bracelet that my grandmother and my grandfather gave me for, I don't know, it was a birthday when I was younger, but they both died. And the bracelet got knocked off, and all of the charms on it went all across the gym, and I couldn't find one of them. And so it was like those memories disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't feel sadness, I didn't feel anything except pain.
That's right. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways in which we counter the effect that dwelling has is by the attachment. Because dwelling makes us want to forget. Because remember, every time we take the measure, our relationship to all the objects around us profoundly changes. I am not there anymore. I am here now. So the ability to attach an emotion to an object essentially causes a kind of remeasuring of the world. I go back I take that measure again in that moment as though that moment were now. So that sense of the measuring always being remeasured can strip away the very essence of what it means for us to dwell in the world. And you're right, one of the primary ways in which that measuring is disrupted is by trauma. If you recall, we said when you're traumatized, you put a bookmark in your life. You stop remeasuring the world. You are caught forever in that moment, in that measure long ago. The process of reclaiming our humanity is the process of learning to remeasure the world again. Does that make sense? Shall I go through that again? I'm sorry? Sure. When we are traumatized, for example, I get sent to the farm when I'm 7. In that summer, I slit open the artery in my left hand. I confront death. At that point, I'm so traumatized that 20 years later, I'm still the 7-year-old boy standing in the field. Because of that, I continue to dwell in the world as though I am a 7-year-old. Only when I take that trauma down can I begin to remeasure the world. A lot of people talk about detaching emotion from trauma. As though we can, in some way, separate the fact from the emotion. I think it's more likely the case that we don't detach the emotion from the event, the fact from the emotion. We learn how to measure the emotion again. That sadness, that realization that I'm bleeding to death and no one is going to save me. All of the emotions I felt in that moment are still here. They just haven't stopped me from continuing to measure the world. I'm not Caligula. Time is not linear. So the possibility of getting up tomorrow morning and being blind is inseparable from the possibility that I won't live past the next moment. Am I making sense? Mm-hmm. I am most human when I am most emotional. If we go back to that sense of time wrapping around itself, in that moment when past, present, and future are all together, when they are encapsulated in an emotional experience, at that moment, I am most human because I am dwelling most poetically. As we mentioned last week, all of my emotions, including angst, become magnified. So the question then becomes, how do I dwell? Mm-hmm. Oh, here? Or here, magnified, sorry. Mm-hmm. Brain rushing. To go back to Wittgenstein, we mentioned this in philosophy too, the concept of a form of life. I'm not sure Wittgenstein would necessarily agree with what I'm about to say, because my understanding is that for Wittgenstein, it's much more of an intellectual and rational. What I'm proposing here is that within Heidegger's unmetaphysical metaphysics, it's emotional. So if I continue to despair and deny, it becomes easier to despair and deny. If I choose to love, it becomes easier to choose to love. That does not diminish. As a consequence of that, I'm constantly reshaping, constantly deciding how I will dwell and what I will experience when I dwell. Okay, questions so far? Yeah, I know. You're plugged in. Okay. So think about this. So yesterday you broke your bracelet. And now every time you touch that bracelet, did you find the missing charm? You will not only remember your parents, your grandparents, you will remember the moment in which that bracelet scattered across the floor of the gym. Every time I look at the dried roses in my study, it intensifies every moment of grief I've suffered. But the tendency is to see the intensification of emotion as diminishing our humanity. And what I'm arguing here is that it actually intensifies our humanity. The more I love, the more deeply I love. The more I'm happy, the more intensely I experience happiness. So, in this context, dwelling cannot be separated from the full breath of human emotion. the more intensely I connect emotionally. The more deeply I dwell. The more intense my angst. Okay, questions so far? Everybody doing okay?
Mm-hmm.
Helpful?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what does this tell us about solidarity? Is solidarity real? Just a possibility? A misplaced hope? A goal never to be reached? If we put it in a combination of Nietzschean and Camusian terms, if I dwell poetically in the midst of the herd, does my dwelling poetically change the herd? Or does the herd continue to be the herd? And honestly, at this point, I'm not totally sure. If by solidarity we mean the possibility of death, then yes. But does our poetically dwelling ever become shareable?
What's solidarity with you over there?
Well, insofar as Camus' argument, you'll recall, is that because we all have the plague, we're all connected. We have the same fate.
But since we are that different, we are all different, then there's a lot of solidarity.
That's right. Because remember, we're back at the question of solipsism. We could also argue that even if it is solipsistic, it doesn't diminish the possibility of solidarity, nor does it diminish my ability to connect to you emotionally. Let's look at that.
If you connect emotionally to somebody, they're not obligated to connect to you.
And that's always part of the problem with love. You may remember a week or so ago, we talked about the uncertainty that's always associated with love.
So there really any solidarity if somebody's not obligated to connect to as well.
Yes. So what do we do? As long as the uncertainty remains, then love is an intensely difficult risk. And what Camus is saying, picking up on Nietzsche and Heidegger,
That being said, the only way for us to achieve solidarity is for all of us to take that risk.
mm-hmm. Yes. So take that a step further. Push it more. Think about the implications of that. Just because someone has allowed you to take their death as your own doesn't erase the fact that you are still going to die alone. And there's a sense in which that giving is always conditional. It can be withdrawn for no apparent reason, so that we never truly escape that risk.
So solidarity only exists when we allow it to.
Mm-hmm. So take the case of Arthur Kessler. Do you remember what happened at the end of his life? He and his wife committed suicide. And the irony of their committing suicide is that they may have thought that they were dying together, but they were ultimately dying alone. There is no together.
What was about where religion comes in?
Uh-huh. Yes. Because one of the ways in which we mitigate the risk and the uncertainty is, again, we're back to David Hume, we postulate the existence of an absolute truth and we call it God. But none of that is ultimately tenable in the face of the reality of the world. Deanna, you look deeply thoughtful.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what trying to do that with everything.
Okay, where can I help?
I think I'm still doing processing.
Okay. So to dwell poetically is to dwell in and with uncertainty and risk. Going back to Paul Simon, the only truth I know is you. That is the essence of what it means to love.
Absolute truth is love basically.
Mm-hmm. Good point. And what I'm about to argue is that this is a different kind of truth, not a logical truth, but a kind of emotional truth.
So basically, a truth on how you do it,
Yes,
or what you define what to be.
yes. Think of it this way, and I'm not sure where this is going to go because I'm thinking through it with both of you. I may never know your most profound moment of sadness, but I can connect to your sadness. If you think about, again, let's go back to the bracelet. I've never had a bracelet given to me by my grandparents break. But when this bracelet broke, which she had given me, I will never forget that moment. I can also guess emotionally that in that moment when this broke, my sadness was very much like the sadness of having lost your grandparents. She's still here, but she will never be here again. Your grandparents are still here, but they'll never be here again. So within the context of the emotional experience of memory and loss, there is some measure of solidarity. I can appropriate your emotional experience. I can weave it into mine. I can experience yours as though it were mine, even though it's never mine. Does that make sense? I know we're in particularly deep territory at the moment. Processing, Deanna?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Can I go back over something before we move on? Okay. So what we're theorizing at the moment is that despite the differences in our experiences, there is some mechanism by which humans are able to share, or maybe the better word is appropriate, that emotional experience. So, in terms of Camus and the plague, we all die differently at different times, but we all know we're dying. And in that experience of dying, I do connect to you. So if we put it in terms of getting to know someone, perhaps what we're doing is appropriating their emotional experience on a much deeper level. If you think about the times that you have met someone, and it's as though you've known that person forever, perhaps that's what's really going on. his or her experience of the world at a deeply emotional level in some shape or form is so close to yours that it's as though you're looking into the mirror. Questions, thoughts? So let's put this in the context of I and we. Potentially nihilistic. The fundamental reality of the modern world is alienation and individuation. The radical individuality that we've seen emerge over the last 400 years, most intensely in the last 100. The reliance on a kind of absolute truth. Which we often see, and we're seeing again now. I and you, us and them. A bifurcation of the world in which we diminish the humanity of other people. I and we a shared experience that's emotional and not logical. There alongside presupposes some measure of solidarity, a sense of togetherness. It, in some way or another, that we still have to work on understanding. A balance of some strange form of alone or apart and yet together. Back to Camus' concept of the plague. Perhaps we can argue that it involves a measuring that we take together. And perhaps I'm able to recognize you as we, because I both see that you are there alongside and that you are apart even though we are together. Thoughts?
Sounds to it a little bit.
Okay. So what do you think the implications of this are in the few minutes that we have left? Well, one of the points that we want to argue is that the IU model ultimately leads to the inability to make moral decisions. Because as we've seen over the last 400 years, without a sense of a universally, absolutely true concept, idea, or being, it falls apart. And it has. There is no sense of togetherness. There's just a continuing sense of separateness. Rather than bringing us together, it emphasizes my being alone. And we talked about the implications of that in philosophy. From my body, my choice, ghosting, canceling, you can't tell me to wear a mask, you can't tell me to be vaccinated, I can own as many guns as I want, I am my world. So, however, there might be a danger of solipsism at the bottom, it will never be nearly as radical as it is in the top. Also interesting of late, the other night on MSNBC, they raised a concept called Texit, which is a variation on Brexit, Britain leaving the European Union. And Texit is a reference to a growing concern that there is a separatist movement in the state of Texas that could cause Texas to desire to secede from the Union. Underneath it is a kind of extremely dangerous view of absolute truth that identifies true humanity with being white, as a Northern European white. So in the face of a diverse world, I'm going to redefine my world simply and solely in terms I want to accept. You're either like us or you're against us. Okay, question.